I never thought my own family would uninvite me from Thanksgiving dinner because I couldn't afford to contribute enough money to their lavish celebration. But when that text message arrived on a cold November morning, it shattered everything I believed about blood being thicker than water. What they didn't know was that I had just closed on the deed to their beloved Oceanview Beach House the day before, and their cruelty was about to cost them more than they could ever imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The notification sound from my phone pierced through the quiet Saturday morning as I sat in my small apartment kitchen, nursing my second cup of coffee and grading math tests from my third grade class. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of my modest one-bedroom place in the teacher's district of Millfield, a far cry from the affluent neighborhood where I'd grown up as the youngest daughter of the successful Martinez family. I glanced at the screen expecting maybe a message from my teaching colleague Sarah about our Monday lesson plans, or perhaps a grocery store promotion. Instead, it was a text from my older sister Christina, and the words made my stomach drop, like a stone. Hey Maya, so we've been talking as a family and we think it might be better if you skip Thanksgiving this year. Mom's planning something really special at the beach house, and honestly, we know money's been tight for you with the teaching salary and all. We don't want you to feel uncomfortable about not being able to contribute your fair share to the dinner expenses. Maybe next year when things are better for you financially. Hope you understand. Love you. I read the message 3 times, each reading making the rejection sting more sharply. The casual cruelty wrapped in false concern took my breath away. They were uninviting me from Thanksgiving, our family's most sacred tradition, because they assumed I couldn't afford to participate in whatever elaborate celebration my mother Elena had planned. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone down on the scratched wooden table that served as both my dining room and office space. For 32 years, I had never missed a family Thanksgiving. Even during my broke college years when I was surviving on ramen noodles and hope, even when I was student teaching and working 3 part-time jobs to pay rent, I had always found a way to make it home for that Thursday in November. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. If only Christina knew what I had accomplished just 24 hours ago. If only any of them knew that while they were calculating what they thought I could afford to contribute to their dinner, I had been sitting in a lawyer's office signing the final papers that made me the owner of the very beach house where they planned to celebrate without me. The Martinez family beach house in Seaside Cove had been our grandmother's pride and joy, a beautiful coastal property that she'd purchased in the 1950s when the area was still undeveloped and affordable. Over the decades, as the coastal town transformed into an exclusive resort destination, the property's value had skyrocketed into the millions. When Grandma Sophia passed away 5 years ago, she'd left the house to all 4 of her grandchildren, equally, but with a complicated trust structure that required unanimous agreement for any major decisions. My siblings had always treated the beach house as their personal vacation home, planning elaborate family gatherings and holiday celebrations there, while barely acknowledging that I had an equal ownership stake. They'd renovated the kitchen, too, years ago without consulting me, installed a new deck last summer after a family vote that somehow happened while I was at a teaching conference, and had been discussing converting the guest cottage into a rental property to generate income that I suspected they planned to manage without my involvement. But what they didn't know was that 6 months ago, when my brother David casually mentioned that maintaining the property was becoming a financial burden and maybe we should consider selling, I had quietly begun exploring options. While they complained about property taxes and upkeep costs during family dinners, I had been meeting with lawyers, financial advisors, and real estate professionals to understand my rights as a co-owner. The breakthrough came when I discovered a legal mechanism that would allow me to buy out my siblings' shares of the property if they were agreeable. It required a professional appraisal and a fair market offer, but it was entirely within my rights as a co-owner. The challenge was that I needed to secure financing for a multi-million-dollar purchase on a teacher's salary, something that seemed Impossible until I met with Patricia Romano, a financial advisor who specialized in helping people manage inheritance properties. Patricia had introduced me to a private lending group that was willing to provide a unique mortgage structure. Because I already owned 25% of the property outright, and because the beach house could serve as collateral for the loan, they were willing to finance the purchase with terms that made the monthly payments manageable on my income. The rental potential of the property during peak season would more than cover the mortgage payments, and I'd have the option to live there year-round or rent it out entirely. But the real motivation for pursuing the buyout hadn't been financial. It had been emotional. I was tired of being treated like the poor relation at family gatherings, tired of my siblings making decisions about our shared inheritance without considering my input, tired of being seen as the family member who'd chosen a modest career and therefore must be struggling financially. The truth was, I wasn't struggling at all. Yes, teaching didn't provide the six-figure salary that my siblings enjoyed in their corporate careers, but I lived within my means, saved diligently, and had built a comfortable life that I genuinely loved. I drove a reliable used car not because I couldn't afford payments on something newer, but because I preferred to save money for travel and experiences. I lived in a small apartment not because I couldn't qualify for a larger mortgage, but because I valued simplicity and didn't want to be house poor like so many of my colleagues. My family had never understood these choices. To them, success was measured in square footage, car payments, and designer handbags. My mother, Elena, was particularly vocal about her disappointment in my lifestyle choices, frequently making comments about when I might get serious about my career and find something more lucrative than playing with children all day. The condescension had reached a breaking point last Christmas when my brother Michael had loudly announced his year-end bonus amount during dinner, prompting my mother to gush about how proud she was of his financial success. When the conversation naturally turned to my year, I had mentioned receiving recognition as Teacher of the Year for my district, an honor I was genuinely proud of. My mother's response had been a patronizing smile and the comment that it was nice to have meaningful work, even if it wasn't financially rewarding. That conversation had planted the seed that eventually grew into my decision to buy out the beach house. I had realized that no matter what I accomplished in my chosen career, my family would always see me as the one who'd settled for less. They would always assume I needed their help, their charity, their consideration for my supposedly limited resources. Well, surprise. Maya Martinez, the elementary school teacher they'd just uninvited from Thanksgiving because she couldn't afford to contribute adequately to their feast, now owned their beloved family gathering place outright. The legal process had been surprisingly straightforward once I'd secured the financing. I had made a formal offer to purchase my siblings' shares at fair market value based on a professional appraisal. The offer was generous, actually above market rate, because I wanted to ensure there could be no complaints about the fairness of the transaction. Each of my siblings would receive a substantial payout that reflected their 25% ownership stake in a property now worth over $3 million. But they had to agree to the sale. And here's where my family's dynamics worked in my favor for once. David had been complaining for months about wanting to liquidate his share of the beach house to invest in a new business venture. Christina had been stressed about the property tax bills and maintenance costs, especially since her husband had been laid off earlier in the year. Michael, always eager for quick cash to fund his expensive lifestyle, had been the most enthusiastic about the possibility of selling. When my lawyer presented the buyout offer to all three of them simultaneously last month, their response had been immediate acceptance. They saw it as found money, a way to cash out their inheritance without the hassle of putting the property on the market and dealing with the complexities of selling a shared asset. They'd been so focused on the financial windfall that none of them had bothered to ask where their little sister had found the resources to make such an offer. The closing had taken place yesterday morning in the sterile conference room of Goldman, Preston & Associates, the law firm handling the transaction. I had sat at one end of the long table while David, Christina, and Michael signed document after document transferring their ownership rights to me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cashier's checks for their buyout payments were substantial enough that David had actually whistled when he saw the amount. "Maya, I have to admit I'm impressed," Michael had said as he folded his check and slipped it into his wallet. "I didn't know teachers could get loans like this. You must have found some kind of special first-time buyer program or something." I had simply smiled and said nothing, allowing them to make whatever assumptions they wanted about how I'd managed to secure the financing. Let them think it was some kind of charity program for underpaid public servants. The truth was far more satisfying. Patricia Romano had been brilliant in structuring the loan. By using the property itself as collateral and leveraging my existing 25% ownership, she'd created a financing package that recognized the beach house's incredible rental potential. During the peak summer season, the property could rent for $12,000 per week. Even renting it out for just 8 weeks a year would generate enough income to cover the mortgage payments, property taxes, and maintenance costs. But I had no intention of renting it out. I planned to keep it as my private retreat, a place where I could spend summers writing the children's book series I'd been dreaming about for years, hosting my teacher friends for weekend getaways, and finally having a space that reflected my own aesthetic choices rather than my family's traditional tastes. As I sat in my small apartment kitchen, still staring at Christina's dismissive text message, I felt a strange mixture of hurt and vindication. The hurt was genuine and deep. No matter how prepared I thought I was for my family's attitude toward my life choices, being explicitly uninvited from Thanksgiving because of their assumptions about my financial situation was a new level of cruelty. But the vindication was sweet. Tomorrow, I would have to decide how to respond to Christina's message and whether to reveal what I'd done. The temptation to immediately text back with a photo of the deed was almost overwhelming. But something held me back. Maybe it was the teacher in me that recognized this as a teachable moment. Or maybe it was the writer in me that could see the narrative arc playing out. They had made their choice to exclude me based on their assumptions about my worth and capabilities. Now I had some choices to make about how to respond. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from my mother Elena herself. "Mija, Christina told me she explained about Thanksgiving. I hope you understand this isn't personal. We're planning something very elegant this year, and we know how hard it is for you to keep up with the expenses when we all contribute equally. Maybe you could come by on Friday for leftovers instead." Leftovers? They were offering me leftover Thanksgiving dinner like I was some distant relative who'd fallen on hard times. The condescension was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. I walked over to my kitchen counter where I'd left the folder of documents from yesterday's closing. The deed to 1247 Oceanview Drive, Seaside Cove, was right there in black and white, with Maya Elena Martinez listed as the sole property owner. The beach house that had been our family's gathering place for decades, where we'd celebrated every major holiday and milestone for as long as I could remember, was now mine alone. My grandmother Sophia would have found this situation both heartbreaking and hilarious. She'd always been the family member who truly understood me, who supported my decision to become a teacher despite the family's focus on financial success. She'd often told me stories about her own struggles to be taken seriously by her more affluent relatives. How she'd bought the beach house with money she'd saved working as a seamstress when everyone thought she was just a simple woman with simple dreams. "Never let them make you feel small, Maya," she'd said during one of our last conversations before her death. "Sometimes the quiet ones surprise everyone." "Well, Grandma," I thought, looking at the deed in my hands, "I think this qualifies as a surprise." I spent the rest of Saturday morning doing normal weekend activities, grading papers, grocery shopping, and doing laundry. But my mind kept returning to the situation with my family. By afternoon, I had decided on my approach. I would not immediately reveal my ownership of the beach house. Instead, I would respond to their uninvitation with grace and dignity. allowing them to follow through with their plans while I made my own. I texted Christina back, "I understand. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'll find something else to do that day." Her response came quickly. "Thanks for being so understanding, Maya. You're the best. Maybe we can plan a separate get-together soon where things aren't so expensive." The patronizing tone made my teeth clench, but I maintained my composure. "Sounds good. Enjoy the beach house." What I didn't tell her was that I would indeed be enjoying the beach house, but not in the way she imagined. That evening, I drove the 45 minutes to Seaside Cove to see my property, my beach house, from the perspective of its new sole owner. The coastal town was quiet in the off-season, most of the summer tourists long gone, leaving behind the peaceful beauty that had first attracted my grandmother decades ago. The beach house sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, its cedar shingles weathered to a perfect silver gray by years of salt air and coastal storms. The wraparound porch that my grandfather had built by hand offered stunning views of the water, and the mature hydrangea bushes that my grandmother had planted were dormant now, but would bloom in spectacular blue and pink clouds come summer. I parked in the crushed shell driveway and used my new key to enter through the kitchen door, the same entrance my family had used for gatherings throughout my childhood. The house smelled like cedar and ocean air, with faint traces of the lemon oil my mother used to polish the hardwood floors during her quarterly cleaning visits. Walking through the rooms as the legal owner felt surreal. The living room with its stone fireplace where we'd roasted marshmallows on rainy beach days. The dining room where my grandmother had served elaborate Sunday dinners to 3 generations of family. The screened porch where my cousins and I had slept during summer visits, listening to the sound of waves until we fell asleep. But now it was mine. Every room, every memory, every future possibility belonged to me alone. In the master bedroom, I found the old photo albums my grandmother had kept, filled with pictures of family gatherings over the years. There I was as a toddler, building sandcastles with my older siblings. Birthday parties and graduations, Christmas, mornings and New Year's celebrations, all documented in fading color photographs that told the story of a family who had once seemed unbreakably close. When had it all changed? When had I become the family member they needed to protect from expensive gatherings? When had my choice to pursue meaningful work instead of maximum income become grounds for exclusion from family traditions? I think it started when I graduated college and announced my intention to become a teacher. My parents had been openly disappointed, having assumed I would follow my siblings into business or finance. They'd made it clear that they considered teaching a backup career, something you did when you couldn't succeed at something more prestigious and profitable. Over the years, that initial disappointment had evolved into a kind of benevolent condescension. They treated me like a family member who'd made unfortunate choices and needed their patience and understanding. They spoke slowly when explaining financial concepts, as if my education degree had somehow limited my ability to understand money. They offered to help with major purchases, assuming I couldn't afford them on my own. The reality was that I'd been quietly building wealth for years through careful saving and smart investing. My modest lifestyle wasn't the result of financial limitation, but of conscious choice. I preferred experiences to possessions, valued time over luxury, and found genuine satisfaction in work that made a difference in children's lives. But none of that mattered to my family. They saw only the surface indicators of success they understood: house size, car model, designer clothing, expensive vacations. By their metrics, I was failing at life, and their Thanksgiving uninvitation was simply the logical extension of that judgment. As I sat on the beach house porch watching the sun set over the ocean I now owned, I realized that their exclusion had actually freed me from something I hadn't fully recognized I'd been carrying. For years, I'd been trying to prove my worth to people who fundamentally didn't value what I had to offer. I'd been seeking acceptance from family members who saw my life choices as character flaws rather than conscious decisions. Well, that burden was gone now. Tomorrow they would gather at this very house to celebrate Thanksgiving without me, never knowing that every bite of food, every laugh shared, every memory made would be happening in my home, by my grace, without my presence. The irony was exquisite, but it was also genuinely painful. This should have been a moment of triumph, but instead, it felt like the end of something precious that I'd been trying to preserve long after it had actually died. The family I'd grown up in, the one that had gathered here for holidays and celebrations, throughout my childhood, had been replaced by something else, something that valued me only insofar as I reflected their definition of success. My phone rang, interrupting my melancholy reflection. It was Sarah, my teaching colleague and closest friend, checking in as she did every weekend. "Hey girl, how's your Saturday? Please tell me you're not grading papers on this beautiful afternoon." I laughed despite my mood. "Actually, I'm sitting on a beach watching the sunset." "Oh, fancy. Are you at your family's place? I thought Thanksgiving wasn't until next week." The question opened a door I hadn't expected. "Actually, Sarah, I have some news. It's a long story, but I just bought the beach house from my siblings. I'm the sole owner now." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd lost connection. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice careful and confused. "Maya, when you say you bought the beach house, are we talking about the same beach house? The one that's worth like $3 million? The one your family always talks about like it's their own personal resort?" "That's the one. And yes, 3.2 million to be exact." Another pause. "Maya Elena Martinez, explain to me right now how a third-grade teacher bought a $3 million beach house without me knowing you were secretly wealthy." I found myself laughing genuinely for the first time all day. It's complicated, but the short version is that I inherited a quarter of it from my grandmother, and I found a way to buy out my siblings' shares using the property itself as collateral. "I closed yesterday." "Holy shit, Maya." Sarah never swore, which made her reaction even more impactful. "This is incredible. Your family must be so excited that you'll be able to keep the property in the family." The laughter died in my throat. "Actually, they uninvited me from Thanksgiving this morning because they think I can't afford to contribute enough to the dinner expenses." The silence this time was longer and heavier. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, something harder and more protective. "They did what?" I read her Christina's text message verbatim, including the part about hoping I'd understand why they needed to exclude me from the family celebration. "Maya, this is insane. You're telling me that on the same weekend you became the owner of their precious beach house. They uninvited you from Thanksgiving because they think you're too poor to participate." "That's exactly what I'm telling you." "And they have no idea what you've done?" "None whatsoever. They were so eager to cash out their shares that none of them bothered to ask how I'd secured the financing. They just assumed it was some kind of special program for teachers or something." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her mind working. As a fellow teacher, she understood both the financial realities of our profession and the creative problem-solving skills we'd developed over years of managing classrooms on inadequate budgets. "Maya, what are you going to do? Are you going to tell them?" It was the question I'd been wrestling with all day. "I don't know. Part of me wants to text them right now with a picture of the deed. But another part of me thinks this is exactly the kind of situation my grandmother always warned me about." "What do you mean?" I thought about Sophia's words, her stories about being underestimated and dismissed by people who should have known better. She always said that people reveal their true character when they think you have nothing to offer them. Maybe this is my chance to see who my family really is when they think they can safely exclude me. "That's incredibly mature of you," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she might not make the same choice. "But Maya, they're planning to celebrate Thanksgiving at your house without inviting you. That's not just cruel, it's absurd." "I know. Believe me, the irony isn't lost on me." "So what's the plan? Are you just going to spend Thanksgiving alone while they party at your beach house? The question sparked an idea that made me smile, for the first time since receiving Christina's text. Actually, Sarah, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? I know you usually go to your sister's place in Portland, but what if I told you I could offer you an oceanfront holiday with gourmet cooking and absolutely no family drama? I could hear the excitement building in her voice. Are you serious? You want to spend Thanksgiving at the beach house? Why not? It's my house now. And honestly, after the week I've had, the idea of a peaceful holiday with my chosen family sounds perfect. Maya, this is either the most petty thing you've ever done or the most self-respecting. I can't decide which, but either way, I'm in. What should I bring? As we planned our alternative Thanksgiving celebration, I felt something shift inside me. Instead of spending the holiday feeling sorry for myself or plotting revenge against my family, I could create something positive and meaningful. I could invite the people who actually valued my presence to share in the abundance I'd worked so hard to achieve. By the time I hung up with Sarah, we'd planned a Thanksgiving dinner for 6. She would bring her boyfriend Marcus and her teenage daughter Amy, who was one of my former students. I would invite my neighbor Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow who'd been dreading spending the holiday alone, and my college friend Jamie, who was recently divorced and had been feeling isolated during the first holiday season since her marriage ended. It would be a gathering of people who'd been overlooked or excluded by their traditional family celebrations, coming together to create something new and genuine. We'd cook together, share stories, take long walks on the beach, and celebrate. Gratitude without the undercurrent of judgment and competition that had poisoned my family gatherings for years. As I locked up the beach house and drove home through the dark coastal roads, I realized that my family's rejection had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible: the freedom to define my own relationships and celebrations according to my own values. They would spend Thanksgiving at my house without me, never knowing that their hostess was absent not because she couldn't afford to attend, but because she'd chosen to create something better elsewhere. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the lesson they needed to learn about the consequences of judging people by their own limited understanding of worth and success. The real question was how long I would let them remain in ignorance, and what would happen when they finally learned the truth about who was really struggling and who was thriving in this family drama they'd created. The week leading up to Thanksgiving unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance where I was both the director and the audience, watching my family's assumptions play out in real time, while they remained blissfully unaware of the truth lurking beneath their surface-level judgments. Monday morning brought a flurry of family group texts that I watched with growing amazement. My mother, Elena, had created a new chat thread titled Thanksgiving Beach House Celebration that included David, Christina, Michael, and their respective spouses, but notably excluded me. I only knew about it because Christina, in what I assumed was a moment of guilty conscience, forwarded me screenshots of the planning discussions. "Look how organized Mom is being," Christina texted me privately. "She's really going all out this year. I feel bad that you can't be there, but honestly, Maya, the budget she's put together would be tough even for us." The budget she referenced was truly spectacular. Elena had planned a 4-day celebration that included catered appetizers from the town's most expensive restaurant, premium wine selections, professionally arranged floral centerpieces, and hired staff to handle cleanup. The cost per person came to over $400, not including accommodations, which they divided among the participating families. $400 per person for a Thanksgiving dinner. The amount was so excessive it bordered on absurd, clearly designed to create an atmosphere of exclusivity that would justify my absence. This wasn't about celebrating gratitude and family togetherness. This was about demonstrating status and separating the financially worthy from the presumed have-nots. What struck me most wasn't the expense itself, but the casual cruelty of the planning process. In message after message, my family discussed logistics, menu preferences, and decoration choices for a celebration taking place in what they still believed was their shared family property. They debated whether to hire a bartender for the weekend, discussed which bedrooms each couple would occupy, and argued about the best time to schedule their traditional family photo on the beach. Their traditional family photo at my house. Without me. Tuesday brought an unexpected call from David, the brother who'd been most vocal about wanting to liquidate his share of the beach house. He sounded cheerful and slightly condescending, in that particular way that successful older siblings often adopt when speaking to their less fortunate relatives. "Maya, I wanted to thank you again for making that buyout possible," he said without preamble. "That check came at exactly the right time for my new business venture. You really saved me from having to find other investors." I murmured something, appropriately supportive while internally marveling at his complete obliviousness. David was thanking me for the privilege of purchasing his share of a property where he planned to celebrate Thanksgiving without me. "I know it must have been a stretch for you to get that kind of financing," he continued, his tone dripping with patronizing admiration. "But hey, at least now you don't have to worry about those property tax bills and maintenance costs anymore. We always felt bad that you were stuck paying for upkeep on a place you probably couldn't afford to use very often." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. David was expressing relief that I was no longer burdened by expenses related to a property he assumed I couldn't afford to enjoy, while simultaneously planning an elaborate celebration there that I was deemed too poor to attend. "Actually, David, I was hoping to ask you about something," I said, deciding to test just how deep his assumptions ran. "I was thinking of maybe planning a small getaway to the coast this weekend. Do you know of any affordable places to stay in Seaside Cove?" The pause that followed was long enough that I wondered if our connection had dropped. When David finally responded, his voice carried a mixture of confusion and concern. "Maya, you know the beach house is going to be occupied this weekend, right? We're all going to be there for Thanksgiving. And honestly, even the budget motels in Seaside Cove are pretty expensive during holiday weekends. Maybe you could find somewhere a little farther inland?" I assured him I'd figure something out and ended the call before my laughter could betray the absurdity of the situation. My own brother was advising me to avoid the expensive coastal area where I now owned prime oceanfront real estate, while planning to occupy that very property for a celebration I'd been excluded from. Wednesday evening brought the most surreal development yet. Elena called me directly, her voice warm with the particular type of maternal concern that I'd learned to recognize as deeply condescending. "Mija, I've been thinking about you all day," she began, using the Spanish endearment that she typically reserved for moments when she wanted to soften the blow of her criticism. "I hate that you're going to be alone for Thanksgiving. It breaks my heart." I let the silence stretch, curious to see where this conversation would lead. "I was wondering," she continued, "what are your plans for tomorrow? Please tell me you're not just going to sit in that little apartment by yourself." The phrase, "that little apartment," carried the weight of years of subtle disapproval about my living situation. Elena had never understood why I chose to rent a modest one-bedroom place when I could have stretched my budget for something larger and more impressive. The fact that I preferred the freedom and simplicity of my current arrangement was incomprehensible to her value system. "I'm actually planning to spend the day with friends," I told her truthfully. "We're going to cook together and enjoy each other's company." "Oh, that's wonderful, honey. Will you be doing a potluck? Those can be so economical when everyone contributes something simple." The assumption that my celebration would be budget-driven, organized around economic necessity rather than choice, was so perfectly in character that I almost admired its consistency. Elena couldn't conceive of a world where I might be hosting an elegant gathering by choice, rather than settling for a cheap alternative by necessity. "Something like that," I agreed. "I think it'll be really special." "I'm sure it will be, Mija. And you know what? Next year, things might be different. Maybe by then you'll have found a way to supplement your income, or perhaps you could look into tutoring or summer school opportunities to boost your savings. There it was, the explicit suggestion that my current financial situation was temporary and fixable if I just applied myself appropriately. Elena was offering career advice designed to help me eventually afford participation in my own family's celebrations. That's thoughtful of you to suggest, Mom. I'll definitely keep that in mind. Good. And Maya? If you need anything this weekend, don't hesitate to call. I know we'll be busy with our celebration, but family is family. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment kitchen staring at my reflection in the darkened window. Family is family, she'd said, apparently without recognizing the irony of excluding her youngest daughter from the family celebration while offering her conditional support from a distance. That evening, I made my final preparations for the Thanksgiving dinner I'd planned. Sarah had coordinated with our other guests to create a menu that was both elegant and collaborative. Mrs. Chen was bringing her famous dumplings and a traditional Chinese dessert. Jamie was handling the appetizers and wine selection. Sarah's boyfriend Marcus had volunteered to smoke a turkey using a technique he'd perfected during his years living in North Carolina. Amy, Sarah's daughter, was preparing handmade place cards and centerpieces using materials from her art class. I would be responsible for the sides, desserts, and overall coordination, which felt perfectly appropriate since I was hosting in my own home. The menu we'd planned was sophisticated without being ostentatious, focused on quality ingredients and careful preparation rather than expensive displays of wealth. As I drove to the beach house Wednesday evening to begin preparations, I reflected on the strange parallel celebrations that would unfold tomorrow. Less than 24 hours apart, my family would gather in the same location where I'd spent the day cooking and decorating, never knowing that every surface they touched, every view they admired, every comfort they enjoyed belonged to the eye. Daughter and sister they'd deemed unworthy of inclusion. The house felt different as I unlocked the door that night, no longer just a shared family property, but genuinely my own space to shape and enjoy. I spent an hour walking through each room, reimagining how they might look with my aesthetic choices rather than the traditional decor my mother had maintained for decades. The dining room where my family would sit tomorrow was currently arranged with Elena's preferred formal place settings and elaborate crystal stemware. By tomorrow evening, those same tables would hold the simple, elegant arrangements Amy was creating, accompanied by the casual dinnerware that better matched my preference for comfortable rather than intimidating dining experiences. Thursday morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of brilliant November sunshine that made the ocean sparkle like scattered diamonds. I arrived at the beach house at 8 o'clock to begin cooking, feeling a sense of ownership and belonging that I'd never experienced during family gatherings. This was my kitchen, my space, my celebration to create exactly as I envisioned it. Sarah arrived shortly after 9 with her arms full of grocery bags and her face bright with excitement. Maya, I have to say this again. This house is absolutely gorgeous. I can't believe your family thinks you can't afford to contribute to celebrations here. Well, technically they're not wrong, I said, pulling vegetables from the refrigerator. I can't afford to contribute to their celebrations. I can only afford to host my own. Marcus arrived next, wheeling a professional-grade smoker that he'd somehow managed to transport in his pickup truck. Ladies, I hope you're ready for the best turkey you've ever tasted. This bird is going to be perfection. The morning flew by in a whirlwind of cooking, laughing, and collaborative meal preparation that felt entirely different from the tense, performance-oriented family gatherings I'd grown accustomed to. Instead of worrying about whether my contributions were impressive enough or whether my appearance met family standards, I found myself simply enjoying the process of creating something beautiful with people who valued my presence. Mrs. Chen arrived at noon with her granddaughter Lily, a college student who was studying marine biology and was fascinated by the coastal ecosystem visible from the beach house windows. Maya, you didn't tell me your family's house was this spectacular, Mrs. Chen said, admiring the ocean view from the kitchen window. It's actually my house now, I explained, enjoying the surprise that crossed both their faces. I recently bought out my family's shares. Your house? Lily asked, her eyes wide. But you're a teacher. How did you afford a place like this? It was an honest question from a young person trying to understand career possibilities, so different from my family's. Assumptions about my limitations? I explained the inheritance structure and creative financing that had made the purchase possible, watching Lily's expression shift from confusion to admiration. That's incredibly smart, she said. You found a way to turn your existing asset into complete ownership while creating a sustainable financial structure. That's exactly the kind of creative problem-solving they teach us in my economics classes. The validation from this bright young woman meant more to me than she could possibly know. Here was someone from a younger generation recognizing my transaction as financially savvy rather than desperate, innovative rather than pathetic. Jamie arrived in the early afternoon with her teenage son, Connor, both of them carrying carefully wrapped contributions to our feast. Jamie looked more relaxed than I'd seen her since her divorce, and Connor, typically sullen during family gatherings, seemed genuinely interested in exploring the beach house and surrounding area. "Aunt Maya, this place is amazing," he said, using the honorary title he'd given me years ago. "Can we go down to the beach later? I want to look for shells for my photography project." As the afternoon progressed, our alternative family dinner took shape beautifully. The house filled with the mingled aromas of Marcus's smoking turkey, Mrs. Chen's dumplings, and the various side dishes we'd prepared together. Amy's centerpieces transformed the dining room into something elegant but welcoming, a perfect reflection of the inclusive celebration we'd created. Around 4 o'clock, as we were putting finishing touches on our preparations, I noticed a familiar car pulling into the driveway next door. The Hendersons, longtime neighbors of the beach house, were arriving for their own Thanksgiving celebration. Mrs. Henderson spotted me through the kitchen window and waved enthusiastically. I stepped onto the back porch to greet her, and she immediately hurried over with the kind of excited energy that suggested she had news to share. "Maya! How wonderful to see you here. I was so surprised when your mother called last week to tell me about the ownership change. She said you'd bought the house from your siblings. Congratulations, dear. Your grandmother would be so proud." My stomach dropped as the implications of her words became clear. Elena had called the neighbors to inform them about the property ownership change. My mother knew exactly who now owned the beach house where she'd planned tomorrow's elaborate celebration, without me. "My mother called you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh yes, just a few days ago. She wanted to make sure we knew that you were the new owner, and that any maintenance issues or concerns should be directed to you instead of the family group." She seemed very pleased about the arrangement. Mrs. Henderson continued chatting about property management and neighborhood updates, but I barely heard her words. My mind was reeling with the realization that my family's exclusion of me from Thanksgiving hadn't been based on ignorance about my financial situation. They knew I owned the beach house. They knew I'd secured financing for a multi-million-dollar purchase. They knew I was the sole owner of the property where they planned to celebrate without me. And they'd uninvited me anyway. The cruelty wasn't born of misunderstanding or misguided concern about my financial limitations. It was deliberate and calculated, designed to put me in my place despite clear evidence that their assumptions about my circumstances were wrong. I excused myself from the conversation with Mrs. Henderson and returned to the kitchen, where my chosen family was putting final touches on our feast. Sarah took one look at my face and immediately moved closer. "Maya, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I pulled her aside and quietly explained what I'd just learned. Her face went through a progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger so pure it was almost frightening. "They know?" she whispered. "They know you own this place and they still uninvited you from Thanksgiving?" I nodded, still processing the implications myself. "Maya, that's not just cruel. That's pathological. They excluded you from a family celebration at your own house, while knowing perfectly well that you could afford to participate. The rest of our dinner preparations continued, but the discovery had fundamentally changed my understanding of the situation. This wasn't about money or perceived limitations. This was about power, control, and a family dynamic so toxic that they were willing to hurt me deliberately rather than acknowledge that their assumptions about my life had been wrong. As we sat down to our beautiful Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by people who genuinely valued my presence and contributions, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the authentic relationships I'd cultivated and the abundance I'd created through my own efforts. Grief for the family relationships I'd thought could be repaired with time, patience, and understanding. Mrs. Chen raised her glass as the sun set over the ocean outside my dining room windows. "I'd like to propose a toast," she said in her gentle voice, "to Maya, for opening her beautiful home to all of us, and for showing us that family is what we create, not just what we're born into." As glasses clinked around the table and conversations resumed, I realized that my family's deliberate exclusion had inadvertently given me something precious: clarity about who deserved my energy, my love, and my trust. Tomorrow, they would arrive at my house for their celebration, knowing full well whose hospitality they were enjoying while celebrating my absence. The question was no longer whether to tell them I knew the truth. The question was how to respond to a level of deliberate cruelty that I was only beginning to understand. Friday morning arrived with an intensity that made the autumn air feel electric. I woke in the master bedroom of my beach house, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the ocean where waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and the distant call of seagulls, trying to process the emotional earthquake that Mrs. Henderson's revelation had triggered the day before. They knew. My family knew I owned this house, knew I had successfully navigated a complex financial transaction that proved their assumptions about my capabilities were completely wrong, and they had still chosen to exclude me from our traditional family celebration. The deliberate nature of their cruelty was breathtaking in its calculated precision. I made coffee in the kitchen where just hours before my chosen family had created magic together, cooking and laughing and building something genuine from shared affection rather than obligation. The contrast between yesterday's warmth and the cold realization about my biological family's intentions felt stark and clarifying. My phone buzzed with a text from Christina, sent at 7:30 in the morning. "Maya, we're planning to head over to the beach house around 10 to start setting up for today's celebration. Hope you're having a good day wherever you end up." The casual cheerfulness of her message, the complete absence of self-awareness about the situation she was describing, made something crystallize in my chest. She was informing me about their arrival schedule for a celebration at my house, a celebration I'd been excluded from, with the breezy tone of someone sharing plans for a party I couldn't possibly be interested in attending. But what struck me even more was the phrase, "wherever you end up," as if I were some kind of holiday refugee, wandering from place to place hoping someone would take pity on me and offer me a seat at their table. The condescension was so complete, so thoroughly embedded in their worldview, that Christina couldn't even imagine I might have created something beautiful for myself. I walked through the house one more time, noting the lingering evidence of yesterday's celebration. Amy's beautiful centerpieces still graced the dining room table. The kitchen counters held covered dishes of leftovers that we'd carefully packed for everyone to take home. The living room still bore the impressions in the sofa cushions where we'd all gathered after dinner to share stories and watch the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. This was what Thanksgiving looked like when it was built, on genuine gratitude rather than performative wealth. This was what family felt like when it was chosen rather than endured. At 9 o'clock, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was not going to leave my house to make room for people who had deliberately excluded me from their celebration. I was not going to hide while they enjoyed the fruits of my property ownership, the success of my financial planning, and the comfort of my home. If they wanted to celebrate Thanksgiving here, they would do it with me present, and they would finally confront the reality of what they had done. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that struck a balance between casual comfort and understated elegance. Dark jeans, a soft cashmere sweater in deep blue, minimal jewelry that included the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful woman comfortable in her own home, neither apologetic for my presence nor aggressive in my presentation. At 9:45, I positioned myself on the front porch with a cup of coffee and my laptop, ostensibly working on lesson plans for the following week, but actually watching for the arrival of the family who believed they had the right to exclude me from celebrations in my own home. David's BMW was the first to appear in the driveway, followed closely by Michael's Tesla and Christina's SUV. I watched through the porch railings as my siblings emerged from their vehicles, chatting and laughing, as they began unloading luggage and catering supplies. The caterers Elena had hired pulled up in a white van, and suddenly my peaceful driveway was filled with people treating my property like a rental venue they'd booked for the weekend. Christina spotted me first. She was carrying a garment bag and a cooler, walking toward the front steps with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. When she looked up and saw me sitting calmly on the porch, her expression went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, recognition, concern, and finally something that looked like panic. "Maya?" she called out, stopping midway up the walkway. "What are you doing here?" The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. "I live here, Christina. This is my house." David and Michael had noticed the commotion and approached the porch, both wearing expressions of bewilderment. That would have been comical under different circumstances. "Maya, I think there's been some confusion," David said in the patronizing tone he typically used when he thought someone didn't understand something obvious. "We have the beach house reserved for this weekend. We've been planning this celebration for weeks." "Reserved from whom?" I asked mildly, taking a sip of my coffee. From the family. From all of us. We coordinate these things through Mom." I set down my coffee cup and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the photos I'd taken of the property deed after the closing. With deliberate calm, I held up the screen so they could all see the document clearly. "Actually, David, you can't reserve something from me that I already own outright. This house belongs to me now. I bought out all of your shares, remember? You cashed those checks just last week." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. I watched my siblings process this information, their faces reflecting the slow realization that they had fundamentally misunderstood the situation they were walking into. Michael was the first to find his voice. "Maya, we know you bought the house, but we assumed. We thought you understood that family gatherings would continue as usual. We didn't think ownership would change how we use the property for holidays." The assumption embedded in his statement was staggering. They had expected me to purchase the beach house and then continue allowing them to exclude me from celebrations held there. They thought I would voluntarily make myself homeless during family holidays so they could enjoy the property I owned without the inconvenience of my presence. "You thought I would buy a $3 million house and then make myself scarce whenever you wanted to use it?" I asked, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that made Christina take a step backward. "That's not how we meant it," she said quickly. "Maya, you know how complicated family dynamics can be. We thought this arrangement would be easier for everyone." "Easier for whom exactly?" "Because it seems like it would be easier for you to continue treating me as the family member who doesn't quite belong, even when the celebration is taking place in my living room." Elena's car appeared at the end of the driveway. a silver Lexus that she drove with the same careful precision she applied to every aspect of her life. I watched my mother emerge from the driver's seat, instantly assessing the situation as she noticed her children clustered around the porch, where I sat with obvious comfort and belonging. She approached the group with the measured steps of someone preparing for a confrontation she'd hoped to avoid. When she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she looked up at me with an expression that combined disappointment, frustration, and something that might have been guilt. "Maya, mija, what are you doing here? I thought you had plans with your friends today." "I did have plans with friends, Mom. Yesterday. We had a beautiful Thanksgiving dinner right here in my dining room." Elena's face went pale as the implications of my statement became clear. "You were here yesterday?" "I was. We cooked together, shared stories, gave thanks for genuine relationships, and celebrated the holiday in exactly the spirit Grandma Sophia would have appreciated." I paused, letting that sink in. "And today I'm still here, because this is my home." The catering staff had stopped unloading their van and were watching this family drama unfold with the uncomfortable fascination of people who wanted to leave but couldn't until they received direction about their services. Elena climbed the porch steps slowly, her usual commanding presence notably subdued. When she reached my level, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Maya, I think we need to have a private conversation." "I don't think so, Mom. Privacy is what allowed this situation to develop in the first place. You called Mrs. Henderson to inform her about the ownership change. You knew exactly who owned this house when you planned your celebration and decided I wasn't welcome to attend." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Elena's composure, normally unshakable, began to crack around the edges. "That's not... You don't understand the full situation, Maya." "Then explain it to me. Explain how you justify excluding your daughter from a family celebration at her own house. Explain the logic that makes that behavior acceptable." Christina stepped forward, apparently trying to diffuse the tension. "Maya, maybe we could work something out. You could join us for part of the celebration. We could make room." "Make room?" The phrase escaped as a laugh that held no humor. "Christina, you're standing in my driveway, planning to celebrate in my house, eating food prepared in my kitchen, and you're offering to make room for me? Do you understand how insane that sounds?" David tried a different approach, one that revealed just how deeply their entitlement ran. "Look, Maya, we paid for all the catering, the decorations, the whole celebration. We've invested a lot of money in this weekend. Maybe you could go stay somewhere else for a couple of days, and we'll cover your hotel costs." The audacity was breathtaking. My brother was offering to pay for a hotel room so I could be displaced from my own home while they enjoyed a weekend celebration there. He was treating me like an inconvenient tenant who could be temporarily relocated for their convenience. "David, let me make sure I understand your proposal correctly. You want me to leave my house so you can celebrate a holiday there that I was specifically uninvited from, and you think paying for a hotel room is an appropriate solution to this problem you've created?" Michael jumped in with his own version of reasonableness. "Maya, we're family. Surely we can figure out a compromise that works for everyone. Maybe you could stay, but in one of the smaller bedrooms, and just keep a low profile during the main events." A low profile, in my own house. During a family celebration I'd been excluded from because they deemed me unworthy of full participation. The suggestions they were making revealed the depth of their inability to recognize what they had done. They thought this was a logistical problem that could be solved with better space allocation and diplomatic compromise. They couldn't grasp that this was a fundamental violation of family relationships and basic human decency. "I have a better idea," I said, standing up from my porch chair and addressing the entire group that had gathered to negotiate my displacement from my own property. "You can leave." The simple statement created another moment of profound silence. Elena's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like panic. "Maya, you can't be serious. We have family flying in from other states. The caterers are here. Everything is planned and paid for. Then you should have included me in those plans instead of assuming you could use my house without my permission. But we're family, Christina said, her voice carrying a note of desperation. This is what families do. We share resources and support each other. Is that what we do, Christina? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like what this family does is judge each other's worth based on income, exclude members who don't meet arbitrary standards, and then expect those same members to provide resources without recognition or inclusion. The caterers were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, clearly wondering whether they should begin setting up or pack everything back into their van. Elena noticed their hesitation and tried to regain control of the situation. Maya, let's go inside and discuss this privately. There's no need to have this conversation in front of strangers. These aren't strangers, Mom. These are the people you hired to work in my house. And frankly, I think they deserve to know whether they're setting up for a celebration or packing everything back up. I turned to address the catering manager directly. I'm Maya Martinez, and I own this property. I did not authorize any catering services for today, and I'm not responsible for payment for services I didn't request. The manager, a professional woman in her 40s, looked between me and Elena with the expression of someone who had unfortunately found herself in the middle of a family dispute. Ma'am, we have a contract signed by Elena Martinez for services at this address today. I understand that, but Elena Martinez doesn't own this property and doesn't have the authority to contract services here without my permission. If you'd like to proceed with the event, you'll need authorization from me as the property owner. Elena's face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger. Maya, this is ridiculous. You're making a scene over nothing. Over nothing? The phrase triggered something in me that I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Mom, you excluded me from Thanksgiving. You planned an elaborate celebration at my house and deliberately left me out. You knew I owned this property, and you still treated me like I was too poor and pathetic to participate in my own family's holiday. And now you're calling my response to that treatment nothing? We were trying to be considerate, Elena said, her voice rising with frustration. We knew the expenses would be difficult for you on a teacher's salary. You knew the expenses would be difficult for someone who had just purchased a $3 million house? You thought someone who had successfully secured financing for this property would struggle with a $400 dinner contribution? Michael stepped forward with what he clearly thought was a reasonable explanation. Maya, we know you stretched yourself financially to buy this place. We didn't want to put additional pressure on you when you're probably dealing with a huge mortgage payment. So, your solution was to exclude me entirely, rather than, say, asking me what I could afford or offering to adjust the budget to include everyone? We were trying to be sensitive, Christina said. We didn't want to make you feel bad about not being able to keep up with the family's financial expectations. The word sensitive in relation to their behavior was so absurd that I actually did laugh this time. Christina, do you understand that what you just described is the opposite of sensitivity? You made assumptions about my financial situation, planned a celebration at my house based on those assumptions, excluded me from that celebration, and now you're defending those choices as consideration for my feelings. David tried one more approach, appealing to what he apparently thought were my better angels. Look, Maya, we made a mistake. We should have handled this differently. But now we're all here. The food is ordered. Family is coming. Can't we just move forward and make the best of the situation? Whose mistake was it, David? Be specific. He looked uncomfortable with the direct question. Well, all of us, I guess. We should have communicated better. That's not specific enough. What exactly was the mistake? What should you have done differently? The silence stretched uncomfortably as my siblings struggled to articulate what they had done wrong without actually acknowledging the fundamental cruelty of their behavior. Elena finally spoke, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. "We should have invited you to join the celebration despite the financial considerations." "Despite the financial considerations? Mom, what financial considerations? I bought this house. I own this property outright. What financial considerations were you worried about?" Her answer, when it came, revealed the truth that none of them had been willing to acknowledge directly. "We were concerned that including you would change the dynamic of the celebration. We wanted to maintain a certain level of sophistication, and we weren't sure your comfort level with that atmosphere." There it was. The real reason for my exclusion had nothing to do with money and everything to do with their perception that I didn't belong in their sophisticated celebration. They had judged me unworthy not because I couldn't afford to participate, but because they didn't think I was the right kind of person for the event they'd planned. "Sophistication," I repeated slowly. "You excluded me from Thanksgiving because you didn't think I was sophisticated enough for your celebration at my house." "That's not what I meant," Elena said quickly, but her face showed she knew the truth had finally been spoken. "I think that's exactly what you meant, Mom. You've spent years treating me like the family member who doesn't quite measure up to your standards. The one who chose the wrong career, lives in the wrong kind of apartment, drives the wrong kind of car, and therefore can't be trusted to participate appropriately in family celebrations." Christina made one last attempt at damage control. "Maya, you're taking this too personally. We just wanted to have a nice holiday without any drama or complications. And I was the drama and complication you wanted to avoid. Got it." The catering manager cleared her throat diplomatically. "Excuse me, but we need to know how to proceed. Should we set up for the event or pack everything back up?" All eyes turned to me. Elena, David, Christina, and Michael all looked at me with expressions that ranged from hopeful to desperate, waiting for me to solve the problem they had created by graciously allowing them to proceed with their plans in my home. The moment felt suspended in time, heavy with the weight of years of accumulated slights and dismissals, but also pregnant with possibility. I could take the high road, invite them to stay, and try to rebuild relationships from this point forward. I could demonstrate the graciousness they had never shown me and prove myself to be the bigger person in this situation. Or I could stand up for myself in a way I had never done before, refuse to enable their behavior, and finally establish boundaries that reflected my actual worth rather than their diminished perception of it. The choice felt monumental, like a fork in the road that would determine not just the next few hours, but the entire future of my relationship with my family. I looked at each of their faces, searching for any sign of genuine remorse, any indication that they truly understood what they had done and were prepared to change their behavior going forward. What I saw instead was expectation. They were waiting for me to fix their problem, to accommodate their needs, to make their celebration possible despite their deliberate exclusion of me. They were still treating me like the family member whose job it was to make things easier for everyone else. "Pack it up," I told the catering manager. "The event is canceled." Elena gasped audibly. "Maya, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You wanted a sophisticated celebration without drama or complications? Then you should have planned it at a venue you actually had the right to use." "This is our family's beach house," Michael said, his voice rising with frustration. "It's been our gathering place for decades." "It was your family's beach house. Now it's my beach house. And I get to decide who's welcome here and who isn't." David stepped forward, his face red with anger that he was no longer trying to hide. "Maya, this is petty and vindictive. You're ruining everyone's holiday over hurt feelings." "David, you ruined my holiday when you excluded me from it. I'm just declining to provide the venue for a celebration I'm not welcome to attend." "Fine," Elena said, her voice sharp with defeat and fury. "We'll find somewhere else to have our dinner. But Maya, I hope you're happy with what you've accomplished here today. You've destroyed our family's Thanksgiving over pride and stubbornness. I didn't destroy anything, Mom. You did that when you decided I wasn't good enough to include in your sophisticated celebration. I'm just declining to clean up the mess you made. As I watched my family gather their belongings and coordinate with the catering staff to pack everything back up, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The relationships I had spent years trying to preserve were revealed to be fundamentally broken, built on dynamics so toxic that no amount of patience or accommodation on my part could repair them. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in my interactions with my family for as long as I could remember: self-respect. For the first time in my adult life, I had refused to accept treatment that diminished my worth, and I had enforced boundaries that reflected my actual value rather than their perception of it. The caterers packed up their supplies with professional efficiency, and within an hour, my driveway was empty except for my own car. My family had left without extended goodbyes, without attempts at reconciliation, without any acknowledgement that their behavior had been wrong. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of my quiet house, I realized that their departure had created something I hadn't expected: space. Space for me to define my own relationships, my own celebrations, my own family according to my own values rather than theirs. The house felt different now, not just because I owned it legally, but because I had finally claimed it emotionally as my own space, my own refuge, my own home to share with people who truly valued my presence. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How did things go today? Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm better than okay. I'm free." The silence that settled over my beach house after my family's departure felt different from any quiet I'd experienced before. It wasn't the peaceful silence of solitude or the comfortable silence of contentment. It was the profound silence that follows an earthquake, when the dust has settled and you're left to assess what remains standing and what has crumbled beyond repair. I walked through the room slowly, noting the small disturbances left behind by my family's brief presence. Footprints on the hardwood floors from their shoes, indentations in the porch cushions where they'd set down their luggage, the lingering scent of Elena's expensive perfume in the entryway. These traces felt like evidence of an invasion that had been repelled, markers of a boundary I'd finally learned to defend. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since they left, but I'd been ignoring it, needing the space to process what had just occurred. When I finally looked at the screen, I found a collection of messages that revealed just how quickly the narrative about the day's events was being constructed and distributed among the extended family network. The first was from my cousin Rebecca, David's daughter, who was apparently supposed to arrive later in the day for the celebration. "Aunt Maya, Dad just called and said Thanksgiving is canceled because of some kind of property dispute?" I'm so confused. I was driving down from Boston with my boyfriend. Should we still come? The phrase property dispute was fascinating in its deliberate vagueness. David had chosen to frame my refusal to be displaced from my own home as a legal disagreement rather than acknowledge what had actually transpired. It was a masterclass in narrative control, positioning the situation as a technical problem rather than a consequence of their behavior. More messages followed, each offering a slightly different version of events. My Aunt Carmen, Elena's sister, had received a call explaining that Maya was having some kind of emotional breakdown and couldn't handle the family gathering. My Uncle Roberto had been told that Maya was going through financial stress related to the house purchase and lashed out inappropriately. My cousin Luis had heard that Maya had been drinking and became belligerent when the family tried to include her in the celebration. The speed and creativity with which they'd constructed these alternative explanations was almost impressive. Within hours of being confronted with their own behavior, they'd created a collection of stories that positioned me as unstable, financially desperate, or substance impaired, rather than acknowledging that they had excluded me from a family celebration at my own house. But the most revealing message came from my nephew Jake, Christina's 22-year-old son. who was studying journalism and had apparently inherited more critical thinking skills than the rest of the family combined. Aunt Maya, I just got 3 different versions of what happened today from 3 different family members, and none of them make sense. Mom says you had a breakdown, Uncle David says it was about money, and Grandma says you were being unreasonable about sharing family property. Can you tell me what actually happened? I'm supposed to care about all of you, but I'm getting really tired of family drama based on lies. His message offered something I hadn't expected, an opportunity to tell my side of the story to someone who might actually listen with an open mind. I spent 20 minutes crafting a response that explained the situation factually and without editorializing, letting the events speak for themselves. Jake, I own the beach house now. I bought out everyone's shares last week with proper legal documentation and full payment. Yesterday, I had Thanksgiving dinner here with friends. Today, your family arrived to celebrate Thanksgiving here without inviting me, even though they knew I owned the property. When I declined to leave my own house so they could have their celebration without me, they left. That's what actually happened. His response came within minutes. Jesus Christ, Aunt Maya, that's completely insane. They uninvited you from Thanksgiving at your own house and then expected you to leave so they could celebrate there without you? The validation from this young man who had no agenda other than understanding the truth felt like a lifeline. That's exactly what happened, Jake. I'm so sorry, Aunt Maya. This family is seriously messed up sometimes. Would it be weird if I drove down to hang out with you this weekend? I was supposed to go to the family thing, but honestly, after hearing about this, I don't want to be around that toxicity right now. His offer to visit touched me more deeply than I could have anticipated. Here was a family member who, upon learning the truth about what had occurred, chose to align himself with justice rather than with the people who shared his DNA. I would love that, Jake, but are you sure? This might create problems for you with the rest of the family. Aunt Maya, I'm 22 years old and I can choose who I want to spend time with. Besides, maybe it's time some of us started making decisions based on what's right instead of what's convenient for the family power structure. By evening, Jake had arrived with a backpack and a guitar, looking like the college student he was, but carrying himself with a maturity that impressed me. We spent the evening on the beach, building a small driftwood fire and talking about family dynamics, personal integrity, and the courage required to stand up for your values when it would be easier to go along with dysfunction. The thing that bothers me most, Jake said as we watched the flames dance against the darkening sky, is how they're spinning this story. Like, instead of taking responsibility for excluding you, they're making you the villain. That's some serious gaslighting behavior. His use of psychological terminology surprised me. Where did you learn about gaslighting? College psychology classes mostly, but also from watching this family operate for 22 years. There's a pattern here, Aunt Maya. Anyone who doesn't conform to the family's expectations gets marginalized, and then when they finally stand up for themselves, they get labeled as the problem. I thought about his observation, recognizing the truth in it. Has that happened to you? Not as directly as it happened to you, but yeah. When I changed my major from business to journalism, suddenly I became the artistic one who wasn't being practical about his future. When I started dating someone who wasn't from their preferred social background, I got lectures about making sure I understood the importance of compatibility in relationships. It's subtle, but it's constant. We talked late into the night about family loyalty versus personal integrity, about the difference between keeping peace and enabling dysfunction, about the courage required to live authentically when authenticity is discouraged by the people closest to you. Jake's perspective offered me something I hadn't fully appreciated. Confirmation that the toxicity I'd experienced wasn't unique to my position as the family's supposed underachiever, but was part of a larger pattern of control and conformity, enforcement. Saturday morning brought a new development. Elena appeared at my door at 8 o'clock, looking haggard in a way I'd never seen before. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup was minimal, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her typical polished outfits. "Maya, we need to talk," she said without preamble. I invited her in, curious about what had prompted this early morning visit and dramatic change in appearance. Jake was still asleep in one of the guest bedrooms, and I hoped we could have this conversation without involving him in whatever drama Elena was bringing to my doorstep. "I've been up all night thinking about yesterday," she began, settling into one of the living room chairs with unusual awkwardness. "And I need to understand something. When you bought this house, what were your intentions? What did you expect would happen with family gatherings?" The question revealed the fundamental disconnect in our thinking. Elena was asking about my intentions because she genuinely couldn't understand why someone would purchase property without immediately making it available for other people's use. "My intention was to own a home that I love," I said simply. "The same intention anyone has when they buy a house. But this has always been the family gathering place. For decades, Maya. Your grandmother hosted us here. I've continued that tradition. It's where we celebrate holidays, where the grandchildren learn about family history, where we maintain our connections across generations." I could see the genuine distress in her face, and I felt a flicker of sympathy for her position. But I also recognized the manipulation embedded in her framing of the situation. "Mom, if this house is so important for family gatherings, why did you exclude me from the family gathering? You can't argue that it's essential for maintaining family connections while simultaneously using it to celebrate my exclusion from the family." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the ocean view that had drawn our family to this place for so many years. "I made a mistake," she said finally, the words seeming to require enormous effort. "I let my concerns about appearances override my judgment about what was right." "What concerns about appearances?" Another long pause. "Maya, you have to understand. When we planned this celebration, we invited several families from our social circle. The Hendersons, the Blackwells, the Fontaines. These are people who judge everything about how we present ourselves as a family." The explanation hit me like a physical blow. "You excluded me from Thanksgiving because you were embarrassed by me in front of your friends?" "Not embarrassed. Concerned about fit. About whether everyone would be comfortable with the dynamics." "Mom, what dynamics? What exactly about my presence would have made your friends uncomfortable?" Elena's face flushed, and I could see her struggling with how much truth to reveal. "Maya, you know that your lifestyle choices are different from what these families expect. Your career, your living situation, your general approach to life. We weren't sure how to explain or present those differences in a way that wouldn't create awkward questions." The honesty was brutal and clarifying. My mother had excluded me from our family's most important holiday because she was ashamed of my life choices and didn't want to have to defend or explain my existence to her social circle. "So when you said this was about financial considerations, you were lying." "I wasn't lying. I was trying to protect your feelings while managing a complex social situation. By excluding me entirely. By creating an environment where everyone could be comfortable. Everyone except me." Elena's composure began to crack. "Maya, you don't understand the pressure I'm under in these social circles. Richard's business connections, the charitable boards I serve on, the community organizations we're involved with. These relationships require careful management. And I'm a liability to that management. You're not a liability. You're just different. And sometimes different requires more explanation than a social gathering can accommodate." The conversation was revealing layers of family dysfunction I'd never fully understood. Elena wasn't just disappointed in my life choices, she was actively ashamed of them. to the point where she preferred to exclude me from family events rather than risk having to acknowledge my existence to her social peers. Mom, do you hear what you're saying? You're telling me that you excluded your daughter from Thanksgiving because you didn't want your friends to know that she exists. That's not how I would phrase it. How would you phrase it? She was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with how to articulate her position in a way that didn't sound as awful as it actually was. I would say that I made a choice to prioritize the comfort of the group over the inclusion of one individual, and that choice was wrong. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, but it was also an admission that revealed the fundamental problem in our relationship. To Elena, I wasn't a cherished daughter whose presence enhanced any gathering. I was a social challenge to be managed, an anomaly to be explained, a complication to be avoided when convenience demanded it. And now? I asked. What happens going forward? I'm hoping we can find a way to repair this, to rebuild our relationship and restore family harmony. What would that look like to you? Elena's answer revealed that she still didn't fully understand the gravity of what had occurred. I think we need to establish some guidelines about how to handle family gatherings at the beach house. Maybe a schedule that works for everyone, or a cost-sharing arrangement that takes into account different financial situations. She was still thinking about this as a logistics problem rather than a fundamental relationship crisis. She thought the solution was better planning rather than genuine change in how she valued and treated me. Mom, you're missing the point. This isn't about scheduling or cost sharing. This is about the fact that you deliberately excluded me from our family's most important holiday because you were ashamed of me. I wasn't ashamed of you. Then what would you call it when you exclude your daughter from Thanksgiving because you don't want your friends to meet her? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Elena struggling with the implications of her own behavior. She'd spent her entire adult life carefully constructing and maintaining a social image, and she'd reached a point where preserving that image was more important than maintaining authentic relationships with her own children. Jake emerged from the guest bedroom at that moment, drawn by the sound of our voices. He took in the scene, his grandmother sitting stiffly in the living room chair, me on the sofa with obvious tension in my posture, and immediately understood that he'd walked into the middle of something significant. "Good morning, Grandma," he said carefully. "I didn't know you were here." Elena's expression shifted as she noticed her grandson, and I could see her calculating how much of our conversation he might have overheard. "Jake, what are you doing here? I thought you were coming to the family celebration." I decided I'd rather spend time with Aunt Maya instead, especially after I heard about what happened yesterday. Elena's face went pale. "What did you hear?" "The truth, which is apparently different from the 3 different versions I got from other family members." The room fell silent as Elena processed the fact that her careful narrative control had failed with at least one family member. Jake knew what had actually happened, and he'd chosen to side with me rather than accept the family's version of events. "Jake, family situations are often more complicated than they appear from the outside," Elena said carefully. "There were considerations you might not fully understand. I understand that you excluded Aunt Maya from Thanksgiving at her own house," Jake replied with a directness that made Elena flinch. "I understand that when she refused to leave her own home so you could celebrate there without her, you got angry at her instead of recognizing how messed up that was." Elena looked between Jake and me, clearly realizing that her authority and influence were being challenged in a way she wasn't prepared to handle. "Jake, I think this conversation is between Maya and me." "Actually, Grandma, I think this conversation is about the kind of family we are and the kind of family we want to be. And that affects all of us, not just you and Aunt Maya." The wisdom in his statement impressed me, but I could see it frustrated Elena, who was accustomed to controlling family narratives and managing conflicts through private conversations and selective information sharing. "Maya," Elena said, turning back to me with an expression that mixed desperation with determination. "I want to make this right. Tell me what you need from me to repair our relationship." The question felt like a test, and I sensed that my answer would determine whether any genuine healing was possible or whether we would simply be negotiating the terms of a more polite version of our dysfunctional dynamic. "I need you to acknowledge that excluding me from Thanksgiving was wrong, not just strategically but morally," I said. "I need you to understand that my life choices aren't character flaws that need to be hidden from your friends, and I need to see evidence that you value my presence in the family rather than just tolerate it when it's convenient." Elena was quiet for a long time, and I could see her struggling with the level of accountability I was asking for. She was being asked to admit that her values and priorities had been fundamentally misguided, that she'd hurt her daughter in service of social concerns that shouldn't have mattered more than family relationships. "I can acknowledge that I made mistakes," she said finally. "But Maya, you have to understand that these social relationships aren't just about personal preference. They're connected to your father's business, to our community involvement, to practical considerations that affect our entire family's well-being." "Are you saying that maintaining your social status is more important than maintaining an honest relationship with your daughter?" "I'm saying that sometimes adult responsibilities require difficult choices and compromises. And I was the compromise you were willing to make." Elena's silence was answer enough. Jake had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration, and he finally spoke up with the clarity that only comes from being one generation removed from the immediate dysfunction. "Grandma, do you realize what you're saying? You're telling Aunt Maya that your social reputation is more important than your relationship with her. That's not a difficult choice or a reasonable compromise. That's just wrong." Elena turned to her grandson with a mixture of affection and exasperation. "Jake, when you're older and have more responsibilities, you'll understand that maintaining family stability sometimes requires difficult decisions. I'm old enough to understand the difference between maintaining stability and maintaining appearances," Jake replied. "And I'm old enough to recognize emotional manipulation when I hear it." The accusation of manipulation hit Elena like a slap. Her carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw my mother lose control of her emotional presentation. "I have spent 30 years building a life that provides security and opportunities for this family," she said, her voice rising with frustration and hurt. "Every choice I've made, every social connection I've cultivated, every sacrifice I've endured has been in service of creating a better future for my children and grandchildren. And now I'm being accused of manipulation and shallow priorities because I tried to manage a complex social situation without hurting anyone's feelings." The outburst revealed Elena's genuine belief that she'd been acting in everyone's best interests, that her careful management of social relationships was a form of family service rather than personal vanity. She truly believed that excluding me from Thanksgiving had been a kindness designed to protect me from discomfort, rather than a cruelty designed to protect her from embarrassment. "Mom," I said gently, "I understand that your intentions were complex, but the impact of your actions was clear. You excluded me from our family's most important holiday because you were ashamed of my life choices. That impact doesn't change regardless of how you intended it." "I wasn't ashamed of you," Elena said again, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then why did you exclude me?" The question forced her to confront the contradiction in her position. She couldn't simultaneously claim that she wasn't ashamed of me while also admitting that she'd excluded me because she didn't want her friends to meet me. "I was concerned about social dynamics," she said finally, "because you thought my presence would reflect poorly on the family. Because I thought it might create uncomfortable questions that would distract from the celebration." "Questions? About what?" Elena's silence stretched painfully as she realized that any honest answer would confirm my accusations about her motivations. Jake broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Grandma, what questions?" About Aunt Maya would be so uncomfortable that you'd rather exclude her from Thanksgiving than answer them? Elena looked at her grandson with an expression that mixed love with frustration. Jake, you're asking me to choose between protecting your aunt's feelings and being honest about family dynamics. I'm asking you to be honest about why you think Aunt Maya's life is something that needs to be protected or hidden. The conversation continued for another hour, circling around the fundamental issue without Elena ever fully acknowledging the true nature of her motivations. She offered various forms of qualified apologies and partial admissions, but she couldn't bring herself to admit that she had excluded me because she was ashamed of my choices and didn't want to have to defend them to her social circle. What became clear during that conversation was that Elena's entire adult identity was built around social acceptance and status management. She couldn't separate her love for her family from her need to present that family in ways that enhanced, rather than threatened, her social position. The idea of choosing family authenticity over social approval was literally incomprehensible to her. When Elena finally left, she hugged me with what felt like genuine affection, but also with the tentative quality of someone who wasn't sure where the relationship stood or where it was heading. "Maya, I do love you," she said as she prepared to leave. "I hope you can believe that, even if I've done a poor job of showing it. I believe that you love me, Mom, but I also need you to respect me. And respect means valuing my presence rather than just tolerating it when it's convenient." After Elena's departure, Jake and I spent the rest of the weekend processing the family dynamics that had been revealed over the past few days. He offered insights from his generation's perspective on family loyalty, personal authenticity, and the courage required to break cycles of dysfunction that had been normalized over decades. "The thing that strikes me," Jake said as we took a long walk on the beach Sunday afternoon, "is how none of them seemed to consider that you might have feelings about being excluded. Like, they were so focused on managing their own discomfort that they never thought about the impact on you." His observation was painfully accurate. Throughout all the conversations about Thanksgiving planning, social dynamics, and family harmony, my actual feelings about being excluded had been treated as a secondary consideration at best. "Do you think things can change?" I asked him. "I think some people can change if they want to badly enough," he said thoughtfully. "But I also think some people are so invested in their current way of being that change feels too threatening to consider seriously." As Sunday evening approached and Jake prepared to drive back to college, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for his presence during this difficult weekend. His willingness to seek out the truth rather than accept the family's manufactured explanations, his choice to spend time with me rather than participate in their alternative celebration, and his clear-eyed analysis of the family dynamics had provided me with perspective and validation that I desperately needed. "Thank you for being here," I told him as he loaded his backpack into his car. "Thank you for standing up for yourself," he replied. "It gives me hope that maybe some of us can break out of the family patterns that don't serve anyone well." As I watched his taillights disappear down the coastal road, I realized that the weekend had revealed something important about the future of my family relationships. Some members, like Jake, were capable of growth, honest self-reflection, and authentic connection. Others, like Elena, were so invested in maintaining their current identity and social position that meaningful change felt unlikely. The question was no longer whether my family could learn to value and include me appropriately. The question was whether I could build a life rich enough and fulfilling enough that their approval or disapproval became irrelevant to my sense of worth and belonging. Standing on the porch of my beautiful home, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't experienced in my relationships with my biological family for as long as I could remember. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or reconciliation, but the peace of clarity about what I could and couldn't control, what I would and wouldn't accept, and who I was regardless of their recognition or approval. The battle for my dignity was over. I had won it not by changing their minds about my worth, but by finally believing in that worth myself enough to defend it when it was threatened. Now the real work could begin, building a life so authentic and fulfilling that their judgment became nothing more than background noise in a symphony of genuine connections and meaningful purpose. 6 months later, I stood in the same kitchen where this entire transformation had begun, but everything felt fundamentally different. The house that had once been a symbol of family obligation and painful exclusion had become a sanctuary of genuine belonging and authentic connection. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the walls where I'd hung artwork created by my students alongside photographs from the new traditions I'd established with my chosen family. The changes weren't just decorative. I'd renovated the guest cottage into a writing studio where I worked on the children's book series that had grown from a distant dream into a tangible project with a publisher's interest. The formal dining room that had once intimidated me with its rigidity now hosted monthly dinner parties for teachers, writers, and artists who gathered to share stories, support each other's creative endeavors, and build the kind of community I'd always craved. My phone rang as I finished arranging fresh flowers in the vase that had belonged to my grandmother. The caller ID showed Jake's name, and I answered with the warmth that had become natural in our relationship since that pivotal Thanksgiving weekend. "Aunt Maya, I have news," he said, his voice carrying an excitement that made me smile before I even knew what he was sharing. "Good news, I hope." "The best? I just got accepted to the graduate journalism program at Northwestern. I'm going to specialize in family systems and social dynamics, partly because of everything that happened with our family, but mostly because I want to understand how cycles of dysfunction get perpetuated and how they can be broken." The pride I felt was profound and personal. Jake had taken the painful lessons from our family's crisis and transformed them into academic and professional purpose. He was choosing to study the very patterns that had shaped our relationships, not to assign blame, but to create knowledge that might help other families navigate similar challenges. Jake, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you for turning our family drama into meaningful research. "It's not just our family drama anymore," he said. "It's a case study in how families can either evolve toward health or remain stuck in toxic patterns. And honestly, Aunt Maya, watching you stand up for yourself and create something better gave me hope that change is actually possible." After we hung up, I reflected on how dramatically the family landscape had shifted since that November confrontation. Some relationships had deepened through honest reckoning with past behaviors. Others had remained frozen in patterns of denial and blame. A few had ended entirely, but even those endings had created space for healthier connections to flourish. Jake had become not just a nephew, but a genuine friend and ally, someone who understood both the pain of family dysfunction and the courage required to break free from it. We spoke regularly, not about family gossip or obligations, but about books, ideas, and our shared commitment to living authentically regardless of external pressure. My relationship with Elena remained complicated, but had evolved in unexpected ways. She'd never fully acknowledged the depth of her behavior's impact, but she'd gradually begun including me in family events without the elaborate conditions and social calculations that had previously governed my participation. It wasn't the complete transformation I'd once hoped for, but it was progress toward basic respect and inclusion. More significantly, Elena had begun asking for my perspective on family matters, instead of simply announcing decisions that affected everyone. When David's daughter got engaged, Elena called to discuss celebration plans and genuinely wanted my input about timing and location. When Michael's son graduated from college, she made sure I was invited to the party from the beginning, rather than as an afterthought. The changes were subtle but meaningful. Elena was learning to see me as a family member whose opinions mattered, whose presence added value rather than created complications. It wasn't the maternal acceptance I'd once desperately craved, but it was functional respect, that allowed us to interact without the undercurrent of judgment and disappointment that had poisoned our relationship for years. David and Christina had responded to the family crisis with characteristic self-preservation, gradually adjusting their narratives to minimize their roles in the Thanksgiving debacle, while slowly rebuilding relationships with me on terms that acknowledged my new status as someone who couldn't be dismissed or marginalized. They were careful now, respectful in ways they'd never felt necessary before. Michael had surprised everyone by being the first to offer a genuine apology. 3 months after the Thanksgiving confrontation, he'd called me directly to acknowledge that their behavior had been wrong and to ask what he could do to repair our relationship. His willingness to take responsibility without making excuses had opened the door to honest conversations about family dynamics and personal growth that I'd never expected to have with him. "I keep thinking about what you said," he'd told me, during one of these conversations, "about how we were asking you to contribute to a celebration you weren't welcome to attend. When I really think about that, it's completely insane. Like, the level of entitlement and obliviousness required to create that situation is staggering." His recognition of the absurdity had been validating, but more importantly, it had demonstrated genuine self-reflection rather than just strategic relationship management. Michael was actually examining his own behavior and values, not just adjusting his approach to managing me. The most surprising development had come from an unexpected source. Harrison, Rebecca's new husband, who had reached out independently to apologize for the family's behavior and to express his genuine admiration for how I'd handled the situation. "Rebecca told me the whole story," he'd said during a coffee meeting I'd initially agreed to only out of curiosity. "And honestly, Maya, what you did took incredible courage. Standing up to family pressure when everyone is telling you you're wrong requires a level of self-respect that most people never develop." Harrison had grown up in a family system similar to ours, with rigid expectations about success and belonging, and he'd recognized the patterns immediately. His perspective as an outsider who'd married into family dysfunction had given him clarity about the dynamics that family members often couldn't see. "I've been watching Rebecca struggle with similar issues," he'd continued. "She's slowly realizing that a lot of her anxiety and perfectionism comes from trying to meet family standards that don't actually serve anyone well. Your example of setting boundaries and demanding respect has been incredibly helpful for her own growth." The conversation had led to an unexpected friendship with Harrison, and, through him, a gradually improving relationship with Rebecca herself. She'd begun reaching out occasionally, not with the patronizing concern she'd once shown, but with genuine interest in my life and work. She'd even visited the beach house a few times, not for elaborate family celebrations, but for quiet weekends, where we could get to know each other as adults, rather than as siblings trapped in childhood roles. But perhaps the most meaningful changes had occurred in my daily life, far from family dynamics and relationship repair. The beach house had become the foundation for a life that reflected my actual values rather than other people's expectations. I'd established a summer writing residency for teachers, offering subsidized retreats where educators could work on creative projects while enjoying the coastal environment. The program had grown from an idea into a small nonprofit that provided genuine support for underpaid professionals pursuing artistic dreams. My teaching had evolved as well. The confidence I'd gained from standing up to my family had translated into advocacy for my students and profession that I'd never felt capable of before. I'd joined the school board, spoken at education conferences, and written articles about innovative teaching methods that had gained national attention. The work wasn't more lucrative than classroom teaching, but it was more visible and influential, allowing me to impact educational policy rather than just individual students. The children's book series I'd been dreaming about for years had finally found a publisher, with the first book scheduled for release the following spring. The stories drew on my teaching experience but were infused with themes about courage, authenticity, and the importance of standing up for yourself when others try to diminish your worth. The advance wasn't enormous, but it was enough to validate. my creative abilities, and opened doors to additional writing opportunities. Most importantly, I'd built a community of relationships based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than obligation and performance. My monthly dinner parties had evolved into a salon of sorts, where teachers, artists, writers, and other creative professionals gathered to share work, offer support, and celebrate each other's achievements. These weren't networking events designed to advance careers, but authentic gatherings that nourished souls and built lasting friendships. Sarah had become not just a colleague, but a sister in every way that mattered. Someone who celebrated my successes without envy and supported me through challenges without judgment. Mrs. Chen had become a surrogate grandmother figure, offering wisdom about life transitions and the courage required to build new traditions when old ones no longer serve you. Amy, Sarah's daughter, was now in high school and still visited regularly, working on art projects in my studio and asking for advice about college applications and career choices. On the anniversary of that transformative Thanksgiving, I decided to host another celebration, not as a replacement for family traditions, but as an affirmation of the life I'd built through conscious choice rather than inherited obligation. The guest list included everyone who'd supported me through the family crisis and beyond: Sarah and her family, Mrs. Chen and her granddaughter, Jamie and her son, Harrison and Rebecca, and of course, Jake, who drove down from Northwestern specifically for the occasion. The dinner was everything that original family celebration should have been: grateful, generous, inclusive, and authentic. We shared food we'd prepared together, stories that revealed our real selves rather than performed versions of ourselves, and gratitude for relationships that enhanced rather than diminished our individual worth. As the evening wound down and guests began preparing to leave, Jake pulled me aside for a private conversation on the porch where this entire journey had begun. "Aunt Maya, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying an emotional weight that caught my attention immediately. "What is it? You saved my life." The statement was so unexpected and dramatic that I almost dismissed it as youthful exaggeration, but the sincerity in his expression stopped me. "Jake, what do you mean?" "I mean that watching you stand up to the family patterns and refuse to accept treatment that diminished your worth gave me permission to do the same thing in my own life. I was heading toward a future where I would have spent my entire adult life trying to meet family expectations that had nothing to do with who I actually am or what I actually value." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But when you refused to leave your own house so they could celebrate without you, when you finally said enough to decades of subtle mistreatment, you showed me that it was possible to choose authenticity over approval. And that choice has changed everything about how I think about my life and relationships." The conversation continued as we walked along the beach under stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear coastal air. Jake shared his plans not just for graduate school, but for the kind of life he wanted to build, the kind of relationships he wanted to cultivate, and the kind of person he wanted to become. His vision was grounded in the lessons he'd learned from our family crisis: the importance of honest communication, the courage required to set boundaries, and the peace that comes from living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. "I used to think that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment family members chose to give," he said as we turned back toward the house. "Now I understand that real family loyalty means holding each other accountable for treating family members with respect and dignity." As the last guests departed and I cleaned up from the celebration, I reflected on the year that had passed since that pivotal Thanksgiving weekend. The transformation hadn't been dramatic in the way that movies portray personal growth, with sudden revelations and immediate life changes. Instead, it had been gradual and sometimes difficult, requiring consistent choices to prioritize authenticity over convenience, respect over approval, and personal growth over family harmony. But the cumulative effect of those choices had been profound. I'd built a life that reflected my actual values rather than other people's expectations. I'd created relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligation or performance. I'd found work that felt meaningful rather than just financially necessary. Most importantly, I'd developed an unshakable sense of my own worth that didn't depend on external validation or approval. The beach house that had once symbolized exclusion and painful family dynamics had become a symbol of abundance and authentic belonging. The rooms that had once intimidated me with their formal perfection now welcomed friends and family with comfortable elegance. The kitchen where I'd received that devastating text message about being uninvited from Thanksgiving now served feasts that celebrated inclusion and genuine gratitude. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror and was struck by how different I looked. Not physically, though there was a confidence in my posture that hadn't been there before. The real difference was in my eyes, which held a peace and self-assurance that came from finally knowing my own worth and being willing to defend it when necessary. My phone buzzed with a goodnight text from Sarah. "Thank you for another beautiful evening. You've created something magical here, Maya. Your grandmother would be so proud." The message reminded me of Sophia's words about never letting people make you feel small, about the quiet ones sometimes surprising everyone. She'd been right, but not in the way I'd originally understood. The surprise hadn't been that I could afford to buy the beach house or navigate complex financial transactions. The surprise had been that I could find the courage to demand respect from people who'd never felt obligated to give it. Standing in the master bedroom of my beautiful home, looking out at the ocean that had witnessed generations of family gatherings, both painful and joyful, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of achieving all my goals or resolving all my relationships, but the completion of becoming fully myself, regardless of other people's approval or understanding. The journey that had begun with exclusion and rejection had led to inclusion and acceptance, but not in the way I'd originally hoped. I hadn't changed my family's minds about my worth or convinced them to value my presence appropriately. Instead, I'd built a life so rich and fulfilling that their opinion had become irrelevant to my sense of belonging and purpose. That night, I dreamed of Thanksgiving dinners yet to come, celebrations that would bring together people who chose to be there rather than people who felt obligated to attend, gatherings built on gratitude for authentic relationships rather than performance, of family unity. In my dreams, the beach house was filled with laughter and genuine conversation, with the warmth that comes from being truly seen and valued for exactly who you are. When I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked an ocean that belonged to me in every sense that mattered, I knew that those dreams were already becoming reality. The family that had once excluded me had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the freedom to build something better, something authentic, something that honored both my grandmother's legacy and my own vision of what family could be when it was founded on love rather than obligation, respect rather than performance, and inclusion rather than judgment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.